Something is working against you right now. Not outside of you, inside. And the strange part is, the harder you push, the more it pushes back. There is an assumption so deeply embedded in how most people operate that it never gets examined. It doesn't feel like an assumption. Feels like reality. Feels like common sense. It feels like the obvious way things work. The assumption is this: that to receive something, you must first become someone worthy of it. That you need to build the right identity, the right narrative, the right version of yourself, and then, once that construction is complete, life will respond accordingly. Work on yourself. Prove your value. Earn your place. Become the person who deserves the result. This logic appears everywhere. In self-help books, in motivational content, in the way people talk about success at dinner tables and in business seminars. It has the shape of wisdom. It sounds like responsibility. It sounds like the mature, serious approach to creating a life. But here is what almost nobody talks about. This logic has a ceiling. And beyond that ceiling, it doesn't just stop working. It starts working against you. The very mechanism you believe is getting you closer to what you want begins, at a certain point, to be the precise thing keeping it away. Not because the universe punishes effort. Because the mind, when it is in a certain mode of operation, creates a specific kind of internal friction that distorts perception, narrows possibility, and burns energy on maintaining a story rather than on creating reality. This is what this conversation is about. Not motivation. Not spiritual practice in the conventional sense. A mechanism. An invisible one. That most people never see clearly because they are too busy operating inside it. Daniel has spent years investigating what he calls the engineering of consciousness. Not the emotional side, not the devotional side, the structural side. How the mind generates states. How states create coherence. How coherence determines what the external world can and cannot reflect back to you. And somewhere in that investigation, something became clear that turned a lot of things upside down. The identity is not a tool for creation. It is a filter for exclusion. When you are actively being someone, when you are sustaining a character, protecting a narrative, reinforcing a version of yourself that needs to remain consistent, you are simultaneously sustaining every limitation that character carries. Your identity is not just who you believe you are. It is the complete set of things you believe you cannot be. It is the boundary. It is the outline. And outlines exclude just as much as they include. This is not a metaphor. This is how the mechanism actually functions. Consider the paradox at the center of this. The stronger your identity, the more predictable what you can create within it. A rigid identity is a narrow reality. Not because you are limited as a being, because identity, by definition, is a structure of limitation. It is the collection of patterns you consider to be you. And patterns, by nature, repeat themselves. The problem is not that your identity is bad. The problem is that your identity is working very efficiently, to maintain its own consistency, including by excluding possibilities that do not fit the current narrative. If you believe at a fundamental level that you are someone who has to struggle to get things, your identity will ensure that things keep requiring struggle. Not as punishment, as coherence. The mind is a coherence machine before it is anything else. It does not want you to suffer. It wants the world to make sense within the patterns it has established as you. And that is exactly where the problem lives. Tavian was 34 years old when he noticed something he had no language for at the time. He had been working on a business deal for months, calls, proposals, revisions, follow-ups. The kind of sustained effort that feels productive because of its sheer volume. One evening, sitting at his kitchen table, he put his pen down for no particular reason. not a decision, more like a pause that arrived on its own. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at the table. And in that small gap between one effort and the next, something shifted. Not in the situation, in how he was carrying it. He noticed very briefly the weight of being the person trying to fix this. Not the problem itself, the weight of the character who owned the problem. The narrative of Tavian who is working on this. He did not analyze it. He did not try to release it. He just noticed it the way you might notice a sound in the room that you had stopped hearing because it was always there. Then he picked up the pen and kept going. But something in the texture of his attention had changed. 3 weeks later the deal closed. Not through a breakthrough move he had planned, but through a conversation that happened naturally, without effort, with someone he had spoken to before but had not really heard. He could not explain it precisely, but he felt it had something to do with that moment at the kitchen table. What happened to Tavian has a structural name. It is not manifestation in the popular sense. It is not luck. It is something much more precise. The mind, when it is actively sustaining an identity, generates a constant pattern of tension. This tension functions as background noise that distorts perception, narrows the field of visible possibilities, and alters, in measurable ways, the quality of decisions, the connections you notice, and the energy available for real action. When the identity is suspended, even briefly, even involuntarily, that noise stops. And in the silence that remains, the mind begins to perceive things that the tension pattern was blocking. Not mysterious things, concrete ones, connections that were there, possibilities that existed but did not fit inside the active narrative. This is what Daniel calls the 0 point, not a spiritual state, a functional one, a state in which the coherence machine is at rest, and the field of what can be perceived expands. The access to that expansion is not earned through more effort. It appears in the gap that opens when effort pauses. Before going deeper into that, it is worth being very precise about something, because this is exactly where most people misunderstand. When we say disengage from the identity, we are not talking about not knowing who you are. We are not talking about dissociation or permanent emptiness or becoming a blank slate. We are talking about something far more specific. Identity has 2 operating modes. The first is descriptive. You have patterns, preferences, history, characteristic ways of thinking. That is structural and is not in question. The second mode is defensive. You actively sustain, protect, justify, and reinforce those patterns as if they were you, as if questioning the pattern would threaten the existence of the self. It is the second mode that blocks, because in defensive mode, the identity is not just describing who you are. It is fighting to keep existing in exactly the same form. And any possibility of real change, any opening that would require you to be different from what you are now, is perceived as a threat. Not consciously. The defensive identity does not send a message saying it will sabotage this because you will change. It simply makes the current pattern seem obvious, inevitable, the only reasonable interpretation of reality available. You do not notice that you are blocking. You experience it as realism, as this is just how things are, as I have already tried. Here is a practical way to see this. Think of an area of your life that has been stuck for some time. Money, work, a project, a relationship. Any area where things do not move despite consistent effort. Now notice the narrative you carry about that stagnation, not the rational explanation you would give to someone else. The internal story, the one you tell yourself about why it is this way. That narrative has a central character. That character is you in a specific version, with specific characteristics, with specific limitations. with a specific past that explains the present. Notice how real that narrative feels. It feels like description, not interpretation. Now notice this. If you are that character in that story, you can only create within what that character is capable of creating. The story defines the field of the possible just as much as it defines who you are. The character who always struggles will always find struggle. The character who never catches a break will interpret events in ways that confirm that. The character who does not deserve will subtly and skillfully push away what arrives, sometimes in ways so refined that even the character does not notice it happening. This is not pathology. This is mechanics. This is how the identity operates when it is in defensive mode. The obvious response to this is, then I need to build a better identity, a more positive narrative, a more powerful character, a stronger self-image. And this is exactly what the self-development industry has been selling for decades. Build the winning identity. Affirm who you are becoming. Act as the best version of yourself. The problem is that this is more defensive identity, not less. You are replacing one character with another, but you are still in the mode of sustaining a character, still generating the background noise, still burning energy to maintain the narrative's coherence. And there is an additional problem, more subtle and more important. When you construct an identity of someone wealthy and successful, you are implicitly affirming that what you are right now is not that. The gap between what you are affirming and what you are experiencing creates an internal tension that the mind works to resolve. But it does not typically resolve it by growing into the new identity. It resolves it more easily by finding evidence that the new identity is not real. Because evidence of inconsistency is always easier to locate than genuine transformation requires. Affirmation of identity without internal structural change creates conflict, not coherence. And the mind, being a coherence machine, resolves that conflict in the direction of what already exists, not in the direction of what you are trying to construct. So what actually works? This is where the 0 point, or what Daniel prefers to call the state of suspended identity, the null field, the internal silence, enters not as spiritual practice but as mental technology. The idea is not to be a better identity. The idea is to step out of the mode of sustaining identity frequently enough for the field of perceived possibilities to expand. When you are at the 0 point, in the neutral field, in functional silence, you are not the character who struggles. You are also not the character who has won. You are the observer before any character. And the observer before the character does not carry the character's limitations. This is not permanent. It is not a state you sustain throughout the day. It is a state you access, and from which you return with perception slightly shifted, a field of possibility slightly more open, an internal coherence slightly quieter. The repetition of that access over time begins to change what the identity considers normal. Not because you affirmed a new identity, because you repeatedly stepped outside the old one enough for it to lose the density of the only possible reality. Now the logic needs to address wealth specifically because that is the central subject here, and this is where the reasoning becomes both more concrete and more strange simultaneously. Wealth at its most fundamental is not a quantity of money. It is a state of flow. It is reality responding coherently with what you want, with enough frequency, in enough magnitude, for life to organize itself differently. That flow has observable characteristics in people who sustain it. One of the most consistent and least discussed is that these people do not struggle to deserve. They are not constantly proving to themselves that they are worthy of what they receive. This is not because they have more self-esteem in the conventional psychological sense. It is because they are not operating in the defensive mode of identity. They are not sustaining a character that requires validation in order to function. Wealth as a phenomenon has a specific allergy to a certain type of internal tension. The tension of someone who needs the result in order to feel valid. Not because the universe punishes need, that would be cheap mysticism, but because the tension of need distorts perception and decision-making in specific, measurable ways. Whoever needs the result tends to make short-term decisions that compromise the long-term, interpret signals in ways biased by urgency, create transactional relationships that do not support genuine collaboration, and operate with an energetic expenditure that exhausts before the result arrives. Whoever operates from a more neutral field, not because they are already rich and can afford not to need, but because they have learned to suspend defensive mode, tends to perceive more, decide with more clarity, and sustain action with less depletion. The result does not come from neutrality because neutrality is magical. It comes because neutrality is functionally superior as a state of creation. A distinction needs to be made very clearly here or the reasoning slips. Suspended identity is not apathy. This is the most common misunderstanding when Daniel presents this concept. People here exit the character neutral field 0 point and interpret it as total detachment, as not caring, as leaving everything to chance. That is not it. Apathy is the exhausted identity. It is the character who gave up. It is still a character, just a worn-out one. The 0 point is not surrender. It is a completely different quality of presence. The best way to describe it is this. Imagine the difference between a musician performing with anxiety about being approved and a musician performing because the act of playing is complete in itself. Both want the music to be good. Both care deeply. But the quality of presence is radically different. The first is sustaining a character that needs approval. The second is in the act, without the defensive identity layer on top of it. The second is not apathetic. The second is free of a specific tension the first carries without knowing it. That freedom does not produce less result. Produces more and of a different quality. This is observable. You can likely find examples of it in your own life if you look with enough honesty. Let us talk about money in a more direct way. There is an observation Daniel made over years of investigation that seems simple but has implications that go very deep. People who transform their relationship with money in a lasting way. Not through luck, not through inheritance, not through an unexpected external event. Almost invariably pass through a moment in which they stop trying to deserve money. Not stop working. Not stop creating. Not stop acting. They stop operating with the internal tension that they need to prove something in order to receive. This might sound like a minor psychological detail. It is not. The tension of deserving, the logic that the external result validates the internal value, creates a structure of creation based on deficit. You create from what is missing, from what you are not yet, from the distance between where you are and where you should be. And creation from deficit has a specific characteristic. It perpetuates the deficit. Because the deficit is the engine. If the deficit disappears, the engine stops. And the mind, seeking coherence, unconsciously prevents the deficit from fully disappearing. This is not destructive pathology. It is mechanics. It is how identity operates when it is in defensive mode. The way out is not to pretend the deficit does not exist. It is to change the engine, to move from creating from what is missing to creating from what is. And creating from what is requires, above all, a moment of absolute neutrality about what you are. A null field, a point of observation without active narrative about yourself. Because if you are always looking from inside the narrative, you are always creating within the narrative's limits. There is a layer here that is rarely articulated with precision. Identity is not just narrative. It is also physiological. When you sustain a character, especially in defensive mode, you sustain a specific body state, a muscular tension, a breathing pattern, a quality of attention that is narrow, vigilant, oriented toward threat. This state is not neutral. It has a constant energetic cost. And it literally distorts what you perceive, because threat-oriented attention filters differently from attention at rest. The science of perception is clear on this point. What you see is not what is there. It is a construction filtered through the state you are in. A vigilant state produces perception of threat. An open state produces perception of possibility. Not because reality changes, because the filter changes. And the filter is determined in large part by the state of the identity. Identity in defensive mode, vigilance, narrowing, energetic cost. Identity at the 0 point, openness, expansion, perceptual availability. This is observable. You have probably lived this without having language for it. Moments when you stopped trying, not stopped working, stopped trying, and things began to appear. Conversations that happened on their own. Connections that emerged. Ideas that arrived without being summoned. That was not magic. That was a change in perceptual filter. There is a second layer in this mechanism that has to do specifically with how other people respond to you. The people around you, potential partners, clients, collaborators, employers, anyone whose choices materially affect your life, are sensitive to the state you carry in ways that go far beyond what you say. This is not vague, energetic metaphor. It is behavior, micro-expressions, quality of presence, how you listen, how you ask questions, how you respond when something does not go as expected, how you do not react when your identity is not under threat. Someone operating from the 0 point, from a neutrality that is not cold but stable, transmits something that others perceive as confidence, not arrogance, not indifference, stability that does not depend on result in order to exist. And that quality, stability that does not depend on result, generates trust in others in a way that no persuasion technique produces. Because it is not performance. It is real state. People trust whoever does not need them in a tense way. Investors, clients, partners, all of them respond differently to someone operating from internal abundance versus someone operating from internal scarcity, even when the external numbers are identical. The state you carry communicates before you open your mouth. And the state is determined before anything else by the quality of your relationship with your own identity. Now let us address what the 0 point actually requires, because this is where people most often stop. Accessing the neutral field is not technically difficult. It is difficult in the sense of what it asks you to let go. And what needs to be released is not ambition, not desire, not clarity about what you want. What needs to be released is the identification with the story of why you do not have it yet. That story, no matter how factually accurate it might be, is what keeps identity in defensive mode. Because the story of why you do not yet have is the story of who you are as someone who does not yet have. And while that identity is active, it works to maintain its coherence. Not cruelly, mechanically. The story may be real. The past may have been genuinely difficult. The circumstances may have been genuinely unfair. All of that can be true, and can remain true, while you continue to identify with it as the explanation of your present. Because the mind does not clearly distinguish between this happened and this determines what can happen now. When identity is in defensive mode, the past is not the past. It is the substrate of the current identity. It is what makes the identity make sense. And releasing that, not denying it happened, but releasing identification with the character the past produced. That is what genuinely frightens most people. Because if you are no longer the character with that history, who are you? The answer at the 0 point is, you are the observer before any story, the field before the form, the awareness before the content. And from that place, from that point of suspended active identity, you can create from a field radically more open than any new identity you could construct. There is a point here that deserves careful unpacking because this is where the reasoning can be misread. When Daniel speaks of collapse of identity or suspended active identity, some people hear this as loss of self, as if the goal were to become empty without personality, without direction. It is the opposite. The paradox, and this is a real paradox, not a figure of speech, is that when you exit defensive mode, you have more access to who you genuinely are. Because the defensive identity is not you. It is a construction of protection. It is the set of patterns you adopted to navigate the world safely. They are layers, often very useful ones, but they are layers over something more fundamental. When the defensive layers go quiet, what remains is not emptiness. It is a quality of presence that is far more direct, far more clear, far less dependent on external validation in order to function. Your real preferences become clearer. Your intuitions become more accessible. Your direction, not the direction you should want according to the narrative, but the direction that emerges when the noise stops, becomes more readable. You do not lose yourself at the 0 point. You find what was under the character the entire time. There is a practical dimension to this that needs to be stated clearly, because Daniel does not like leaving concepts floating without concrete grounding. The relevant question is not how do I get to the 0 point. That is usually the wrong question. The more useful question is what prevents me from being in it more frequently. And the answer, almost without exception, is not a lack of technique. It is the active narrative about what needs to happen for life to work. While you are sustaining the urgency that this result needs to happen now for everything to be all right, you are in defensive mode. The urgency is not a circumstance. It is an interpretation, even if involuntary. An urgency closes the field. It narrows perception. It amplifies the noise. It renders invisible what is available right now. Not because urgency is wrong as an emotional state. Sometimes urgency is real and informative. But when it becomes the permanent substrate of action, when you are always in urgency about your financial life, it stops being informative and becomes distorting. The 0 point is not the absence of urgency. It is the capacity to observe urgency without being moved by it automatically. To perceive that urgency is a state, not a truth about reality. That level of observation, which is not cold distance but lucid presence, is what allows you to act with clarity instead of react with tension. And clear action, repeated over time with the right quality of presence, produces results that tense action rarely produces, even when the effort is equal or greater. Let us go into something that is almost never articulated with precision: the relationship between the 0 point and timing. One of the most consistent ways in which defensive identity undermines creation is through timing. Not because you do the wrong things, but because you do them at the wrong moment, for the wrong reason, with the wrong quality of presence. Timing is not luck. It is perceptual sensitivity. And perceptual sensitivity is directly determined by internal state. Whoever is in defensive mode, sustaining an identity that urgently needs result, tends to act too early because they cannot tolerate uncertainty, act too late because they are paralyzed by fear of error, or act at the right moment but with energy that communicates tension, and the correct timing with wrong energy frequently produces a wrong result. Whoever is in the neutral field perceives timing differently, not through mystical intuition, because they have more data available, because they are not filtering reality through the urgency of the narrative. And in the more open field of possibilities that the 0 point offers, the right timing becomes more legible. Connections become more visible. The next step emerges with more clarity. The timing improves not because you learn to calculate better, because you are seeing more of the entire field. Here it is worth questioning something that may have arisen throughout this conversation. Everything said here, 0 point, suspended active identity, neutral field, can sound like a luxury, like something you can consider when the situation stabilizes, when the bills are paid, when the pressure decreases. That reasoning is precisely what perpetuates the situation. The pressure decreases when the state changes. The state does not change after the pressure decreases. This sequence is inverted by most people, and it is one of the most elegant and most quietly devastating mechanisms the mind creates to maintain the coherence of defensive identity. When I fix this, I will finally be able to relax and think clearly. Clarity is what allows the fixing, not the other way around. And genuine clarity, the kind that is not forced, does not arise from additional effort. It arises from the space that appears when a specific kind of effort stops. Not the effort of acting, the effort of sustaining the character. That is the work that does not appear on calendars, does not appear in goals, does not appear in spreadsheets, but determines the efficiency of everything that does appear in them. Here is another dimension of this that rarely gets addressed directly. The relationship between identity and the perception of opportunity. Most people believe that opportunities are either present or absent, that the question is simply whether you are positioned to find them. But there is a more accurate way to understand this. Opportunities do not exist as fixed objects in the external world that you either locate or miss. They are relational. They are intersections between what is available in the world and what your current perceptual field can register. The same environment contains completely different opportunities depending on the state from which you are perceiving it. This is not abstract philosophy. You can test it. Think about a time when you were under extreme stress and a time when you were genuinely at rest. The difference in what you noticed, who you thought to call, what ideas came, what possibilities seemed real, that difference was not in the environment. It was in the filter. Defensive identity is a specific kind of filter that consistently narrows opportunity perception. Not because it is defective, because it is doing exactly what it was built to do. Protect the existing structure. But the existing structure is the problem. And a filter designed to protect the existing structure will, by definition, be poor at perceiving what would replace or expand it. There is one more structural element worth naming before moving toward the final layer of this conversation. It is the relationship between identity and energy. Every identity has a maintenance cost. This is not metaphorical, it is literal. Sustaining a consistent self-image, defending a narrative, monitoring the world for threats to the story you carry about yourself. All of this requires constant cognitive and physiological energy. When you are in defensive mode, a significant portion of your total capacity is permanently allocated to this maintenance function. It is running in the background all the time. You do not notice it because it has always been there, but you notice the effects. The exhaustion that does not match the actual work done, the inability to sustain focus for long stretches, the way a single criticism can destabilize an entire day, the disproportionate weight of minor setbacks. These are not character flaws. They are the energy cost of identity maintenance. When the defensive layer quiets, even temporarily, you can feel the difference in available energy immediately. That energy does not disappear when you are not using it to sustain a character. It becomes available for perception, for creation, for the kind of sustained attention that produces real results. The 0 point is not just a philosophical position. It is an energy management strategy, one that most people never access because they do not know the maintenance cost they are paying constantly. Let us now address a trap that appears almost universally when people begin engaging with this mechanism. The trap is called trying to reach the 0 point. The active attempt to access the neutral field is, by definition, an act of the character. And the character trying not to have a character is simply another form of defensive identity, one dressed in more sophisticated vocabulary. I need to achieve neutrality so my life can change. That sentence, with that structure, is mechanically identical to I need to earn more money so my life can improve. It is the same logic of creating from deficit, the same urgency in disguise. The 0 point is not achieved. It is recognized. It is noticed when the effort of sustaining the character, through exhaustion, through insight, through a simple moment of forgetting like Tavian with his pen at the kitchen table, goes quiet for a moment. And what you do with that recognition over time is simply not immediately return to the character. Stay a little longer in the functional silence. Observe what arises from there, not as a spiritual practice with a scheduled time, as a habit of observation that gradually installs itself in the quality of everyday attention. The territory becomes familiar, the silence becomes less threatening, and the identity, rather than being a wall between you and possibility, becomes more like a tool you pick up when useful and set down when not. There is a specific question that always emerges at this point in the conversation, and it deserves a direct answer. The question is, but if I release the identity, how will I act? How will I know what to do? Action from the 0 point is not passivity. It is what Daniel calls action without internal friction. When you act from the defensive character, there is always a layer of effort that is not about the action itself. It is about what the action means for your identity. Every decision carries the weight of its implications for the narrative of who you are. This creates a friction that is invisible but constant. You act, but at a higher cost than the action itself objectively requires. When you act from the neutral field, that friction diminishes. The action becomes cleaner, not easier in terms of real effort, but without the identity cost layered over it. And clean action over time is more efficient, more sustainable, and produces results of a different quality. Not because a purer intention is rewarded, but because more of your actual capacity is directed at the action itself and less at the maintenance of the character. This is the real engineering, not the management of spiritual states, the optimization of the quality of action through the quality of the state from which it emerges. Let us come to something that ties everything said here together. Throughout this entire conversation, one thing has remained consistent. The mechanism being described is not about changing what you do. It is about changing the ground from which you do it. Most approaches to wealth, success, and creation focus entirely on the surface level, on strategies, tactics, habits, mindsets in the conventional sense. And those things matter. They are real. But they sit on top of a deeper layer that determines how effective they can be. That deeper layer is the state of your identity and how much energy it consumes just to maintain itself. You can have the best strategies in the world and execute them with only a fraction of your available capacity, because the rest is allocated to identity maintenance. Or you can have simpler, clearer approaches that you execute with your full capacity, because the defensive layer has quieted enough to free that capacity for actual use. The second scenario is not about being less ambitious. It is about being far more efficient, using what you actually have fully, rather than having more and using a fraction of it. That is the core shift, not a spiritual one. not an emotional one, a functional one. The state null emerged from the need to go beyond traditional manifestation techniques. It was created to help you understand and sustain that internal point of neutrality where effort disappears and reality begins to respond coherently. More than learning something new, it is a process of dismantling the identity that forces, allowing change to happen through alignment rather than tension. It is a deepening of what has been explored here, structured, progressive, built for those who recognize that the mechanism exists and want to work with it consistently. It is not for everyone. It is not required. It is for those who feel it makes sense to continue the investigation beyond this video. If that is your case, the link is in the pinned comment. Before closing, a simple invitation. If something in this conversation touched a real point for you, not necessarily an emotional one, but a point of recognition of I have noticed something like this but never had a way to articulate it. Leave a comment with your name and one word. Just one word. The one that describes the state you want to sustain or the state you felt while listening to this. Daniel reads all of them. The character you built to survive was necessary. In many contexts it still is. But it is not the source of creation. It is the filter that determines what can and cannot enter. And filters, by nature, are adjustable. Not with force, with observation. That is where this begins.